If you think you've seen the worst of prison life, you haven't seen Rikers Island. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe, because what you're about to hear isn't a movie. It's real, and it's darker than anything Hollywood could ever make up. The lights went out. Complete darkness swallowed Rikers Island. One moment, the fluorescent bulbs buzzed above the cell blocks. The next, silence. Not just the silence of a power outage, but a silence that pressed against the ears, heavy and suffocating. Screams erupted instantly. Inmate calls bounced off the concrete walls, mixing with the harsh clanging of metal doors slamming shut. Somewhere, a fist pounded against a steel toilet, while a guard's flashlight spun wildly, catching glimpses of terrified faces and shadowy figures. "Stay down. Stay quiet," a voice shouted, cracking through the chaos. Mark Johnson, a young inmate in his first week at Rikers, huddled in the corner of his cell, trembling. The darkness was alive, almost breathing. Every shadow seemed to twist and stretch, creeping closer to him. He could hear footsteps, not just the guards, but others moving in ways that didn't make sense. Whispers, hisses, and muffled thuds came from every direction. For 12 hours, the prison became a maze of panic and fear. There were fights, escapes, and even strange noises that no one could explain. Inmates who had always been silent found voices in terror. The strongest, the toughest, trembled like children. And then came the worst sound of all, a door slamming somewhere in the West Block, followed by a scream that froze Mark's blood. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a yell for help. It was something wrong, something that didn't belong. How had the lights gone out? Was it an accident? Sabotage? Or something far darker lurking in the shadows? Hours before the blackout, Rikers Island had seemed like any other day. The guards walked their rounds with clipped, practiced steps. Inmates went about their routines. Meals, showers, arguments over space in the yard. But under the surface, tension simmered. Every glance, every whispered insult, every small shove was a spark waiting to ignite. Mark had been in the prison just a few days, learning quickly that survival here meant staying invisible. He had already seen fights erupt over the tiniest things, a stolen cigarette, a harsh look, a piece of leftover food. But nothing in his short life prepared him for what would happen when the lights died. The first flicker had made him pause. A single bulb buzzing and flashing was normal. But then all the lights went out. The sudden darkness made hearts pound. Fear rose faster than any alarm. Guards shouted instructions that got lost in the chaos. Inmates scrambled, and somewhere deep in the darkness, someone, or something, was taking advantage of the fear. Mark's mind raced as he tried to stay calm, but a shadow moved just outside his cell. It didn't belong to any guard he had ever seen. It moved too fast, too fluidly. And then he heard a voice, low and cruel. "You shouldn't be here." Before he could even scream, a hand grabbed his shoulder, dragging him toward the unknown. The blackout wasn't just a power failure. It was a trap, and 12 hours of terror were only just beginning. Mark's heart hammered in his chest as the rough hand pulled him through the darkness. His eyes strained to see, but all he could make out were shadows, walls, doors, and figures moving like phantoms. The darkness wasn't empty. It was alive, filled with whispers, shouts, and the metallic clang of prison life turned chaotic. "Relax, kid," a voice hissed close to his ear. It was a fellow inmate, older, wiry, and clearly used to the kind of chaos Rikers could produce. "Just keep moving. Don't look around." Mark didn't relax. Every step he took echoed against the concrete, each sound amplified by the emptiness around him. The lights were still out, and with no guidance from guards, who themselves were struggling to maintain control. The prison had become a labyrinth of fear. He was shoved into a corner of the yard. Other inmates pressed against him, some shaking, others whispering frantic prayers. Screams pierced the air from different parts of the prison. Some were fights, some were cries of terror. And then, faintly, Mark heard a sound that made his stomach turn. Someone crying out in pain, but it wasn't human. From the darkness, figures emerged. Men he didn't recognize, moving fast, slipping past even the guards. shadows of violence, theft, and desperation. In the chaos, alliances formed and broke in seconds. One wrong move could cost a life, and Mark felt acutely aware that he was just a newcomer. A guard's flashlight finally cut through the darkness, but the beam was erratic, flickering like a strobe. It illuminated the twisted faces of inmates in panic, then vanished again, leaving everything in shadow. A fight erupted nearby, a sound of fists hitting flesh, metal doors banging, and a scream that made Mark flinch violently. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the west block, the same block where the first scream had come. The entire yard fell silent for a heartbeat, and Mark froze. There was something different about this crash. It wasn't just chaos or fighting. Something had broken, and it wasn't just a door. A piercing scream followed. It was closer this time. Mark recognized the voice. It was one of the newer inmates, someone who had laughed earlier, joking about surviving prison life. Now, that laugh was gone, replaced by terror so raw it made Mark's knees weak. The older inmate grabbed his arm again. "Move! Don't look!" Mark wanted to obey, but curiosity, or maybe fear itself, pulled him back. He glanced over the fence of the yard, and his stomach dropped. A shadowy figure had cornered the screaming inmate, its movements deliberate and unnatural. The guards hadn't reached in time, and even if they had, it was too dark to see clearly. "Please, help!" the inmate pleaded, but the darkness swallowed the words. Then, as if the shadows themselves were closing in, the figure disappeared into the chaos, leaving only silence and the distant hum of emergency lights slowly flickering to life. The yard was a mess. Injured men, frantic guards, and Mark standing frozen, realizing that Rikers Island had changed forever tonight. And in the deepest corner of the west block, something was watching, waiting for the next mistake. The lights flickered back on, weak and uneven, like a dying heartbeat. Shadows still clung to the corners, stretching long and cruel across the walls. Mark sank to the floor of the yard, shaking, trying to catch his breath. Around him, the chaos had left a trail of confusion. Bloodied fists, bruised faces, and terrified whispers. But the worst part was what he didn't see. The screaming inmate from the west block, he was gone. Vanished. Guards were shouting his name. Doors banged open and closed, but no one could find him. Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine. Something about the way he had disappeared didn't feel right. It wasn't just the darkness. It was as if someone or something had taken him. The older inmate leaned close, voice low. "He's not coming back. Not tonight." Mark's stomach lurched. What do you mean?" "You saw it," the man said grimly. "Rikers, it's not just a prison. When the lights go out, some people, they don't survive the night. Not because of the fights, not because of guards. Something else takes over." Mark wanted to argue, but he couldn't. He'd felt it, the unnatural presence in the west block. The way shadows moved like living things, the unnatural stillness in the air before the scream. The rest of the night was a blur. Inmates whispered rumors about the missing man, each story worse than the last. Some said he'd been killed in the chaos. Others claimed he'd been dragged somewhere no one dared enter. Every door Mark passed seemed darker than the last, and every shadow looked like it could reach out and grab him. By morning, the prison tried to return to routine, but the energy had shifted. Guards walked faster, eyes darting. Inmates avoided the west block entirely, as if fear alone could keep them safe. Mark noticed something chilling. People who had been bold before were suddenly quiet, hesitant, even scared of their own shadows. Mark couldn't shake the memory of that night. The darkness had exposed a truth he wasn't ready to face. Inside Rikers, it wasn't just the prison walls that were dangerous. It was the fear, the chaos, and whatever lurked in the shadows during those 12 hours of terror. And then, as he was walking back to his cell, he heard it, a soft, deliberate whisper behind him. "Next time, it won't let you go." Mark froze. The hair on his neck stood straight. Slowly, he turned. No one was there, or so it seemed. By the fourth day after the blackout, Rikers Island felt like a different place. The fluorescent lights flickered nervously, as if they remembered the terror of that night. Inmates avoided each other, glancing over their shoulders even in the open yard. Guards moved in pairs, eyes scanning every corner, voices clipped and tense. Mark couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building, every distant shout made him jump. He replayed that night in his mind over and over. The darkness, the screams, the way the missing inmate had disappeared. Something in the prison had shifted. Something that didn't care about rules, locks, or guards. Rumors spread quickly. Some said the missing inmate had been beaten to death in a hidden corner of the West Block. Others whispered that he had been dragged into a maintenance tunnel and never returned. Mark didn't know what to believe, but deep down, he knew something unnatural had been at work. It started subtly at first. Shadows moving in the corner of his vision. Cold drafts in cells where the windows were shut tight. Low whispers at night, so faint that he could convince himself it was only imagination. But he wasn't imagining it. He could feel it. The prison itself seemed alive, breathing with menace, waiting for the next mistake. Then it happened. Mark was returning from the mess hall, carrying his tray, when he felt a hand brush against his shoulder. He spun around, but no one was there. A cold wind blew down the hallway, carrying with it a faint sound, the low, guttural laughter of someone, or something he could not see. A guard appeared at the end of the hall, shouting orders. In that instant, Mark realized he was alone with the shadows again. And that's when he heard it, a metallic clanging, far too loud to be an accident, coming from the cell next to him. He peered inside. The cell was empty, but the bars rattled violently, like 1,000 hands were shaking them from the inside. Then, from the corner, a figure lunged at him. Not a person, not quite human, and gone in a blink of an eye. Mark stumbled backward, heart hammering, tray clattering to the floor. He ran, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly. Every corner he turned, every door he passed, held the possibility of that same figure emerging again. And then he heard it, screaming, but not from anyone he could recognize. The scream was hollow, echoing as if it came from the walls themselves. He realized something terrifying. The darkness hadn't gone. It had only waited, and now it was hunting. The next night, Mark couldn't stay in his cell. The memory of the figure, the rattling bars, the screams, it all clung to him like a shadow he couldn't shake. He wandered the hallways quietly, hugging the walls, tried to convince himself that it was just fear. But fear, he realized, could make things real. Down in the West Block, the same block where the lights had first gone out, he could hear faint whispers. They weren't words, just low, mocking noises that crawled under the skin. Every instinct told him to run, but he was drawn closer, as if the darkness itself had a grip on him. Mark, a voice called. He froze. It wasn't a guard. It wasn't the older inmate. The voice was soft, almost human, but hollow, echoing off the walls in a way that made him shiver. He edged closer to the source and saw a small cell door slightly ajar. Inside, he glimpsed a figure crouched in the corner. It was the missing inmate, or at least it looked like him. His eyes were wide, haunted, reflecting a terror that Mark could feel in his bones. I can't, the man whispered, voice trembling. It's still here. It's in the walls, it's in the air. Before Mark could ask what he meant, a sudden crash behind him made both of them jump. Metal doors slammed, lights flickered weakly, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than before. The missing inmate scrambled, muttering something that sounded like a warning. Mark wanted to pull him out, to run, but the shadows moved faster than he could. Figures emerged from every corner. Others, like the one from the hallway, twisted and unnatural, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Panic surged. The missing inmate grabbed Mark's arm. "Run," he screamed. They bolted into the hall, but the hallway twisted, confusing their steps. Doors they had passed before now led to nowhere. Shadows lunged from corners. Fists, chains, whispers, they all blended into a chaotic nightmare. Mark realized that Rikers wasn't just a prison anymore. It was a trap, a maze alive with fear, pain, and something darker that thrived in the darkness. And then, from somewhere above, a deafening roar echoed through the hallways. Metal screeching, concrete cracking, and the ceiling seemed to shift. Dust fell around them like rain, and Mark felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. They weren't alone. Something massive was moving through the prison, something unseen but deadly. Mark's heart pounded. There was no way out. Mark's lungs burned as he ran down the twisting corridors, the air thick with dust and fear. Every step echoed, yet the shadows seemed to swallow the sound, making it impossible to tell if anyone or anything was behind him. The missing inmate kept pulling him forward, whispering urgent instructions that barely made sense. "Keep moving. Don't look back. Don't stop," he hissed. The prison itself groaned and shuddered around them. Concrete walls cracked, metal doors rattled, and a distant scream, low, guttural, and inhuman, sent shivers down Mark's spine. The chaos from the blackout night hadn't ended. It had only been waiting, biding its time, growing stronger in the darkness. Mark stumbled into a small utility room, hoping for a moment of safety. The missing inmate slammed the door shut behind them. For a heartbeat, there was silence, only the sound of their ragged breathing. Then, a faint tapping began on the metal walls, slow at first, then faster, almost like a heartbeat syncing with Mark's own. "It's here," the missing inmate whispered, voice trembling. "It knows we're hiding. It knows we're scared." Mark swallowed hard, trying to steady his shaking hands. "What is it?" he asked, but the man didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed Mark and shoved him into a corner, pressing his back against the cold wall. The tapping grew louder, coming from all directions at once. Shadows flickered across the room, twisting and stretching in ways that defied logic. Mark's eyes darted around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. Yet he could feel it. Something massive, powerful, watching them, moving closer. Then, with a sudden crash, the door blew open. A figure, tall, twisted, almost humanoid but wrong, slammed against the room, scattering debris. Its eyes glowed faintly in the flickering light. Mark felt a cold wave of fear crash over him, heavier than anything he had ever known. The missing inmate screamed, lunging at the figure, trying to push Mark out of the way. The figure moved with impossible speed, a blur of shadow and strength. Mark stumbled backward, barely escaping as it vanished into the hallway with a speed that left nothing but a cold draft in its wake. Mark's mind reeled. The blackout night had unleashed something unimaginable, something that preyed on fear, chaos, and despair. And now, trapped in the dark corridors of Rikers Island, he realized there was no escaping it. Not unless he confronted it, and he had no idea how to do that. A loud, metallic roar echoed from somewhere above, the sound of iron gates being torn apart. The walls vibrated. Mark's knees buckled as he realized the impossible. The prison itself was alive tonight, hunting, and in the shadows, those glowing eyes were watching him again. Mark's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. Every nerve screamed for him to run, but the hallway stretched endlessly before him, twisting like a nightmare. He could hear the metallic screech of doors being ripped open, screams echoing from multiple directions, and the low, guttural growl of something that was no longer human. "We have to move," the missing inmate shouted, dragging Mark forward. "It's hunting us." They rounded a corner and froze. The figure from before stood blocking the hall, tall, impossibly strong, and dark as a shadow. Its glowing eyes tracked every movement. Mark felt the weight of its gaze pressing down on him, suffocating him. The missing inmate grabbed a fire extinguisher from a wall mount and swung it at the figure. It passed right through, as if the figure were made of darkness itself. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. Mark's stomach dropped. It's not real, right?" he stammered. The missing inmate's face was pale. "It's as real as the fear in your heart." Suddenly, the figure lunged. Mark barely dodged, crashing against the wall. The sound of the impact echoed like thunder through the empty corridor. The missing inmate tried again, shouting, swinging, screaming, but nothing worked. The figure moved faster than their eyes could follow, a living shadow that seemed to feed off panic. Mark stumbled backward, heart racing, and tripped over something on the floor. He looked down. A pile of personal items, wallets, belts, broken glasses, lay scattered. Remnants of other inmates who had faced the darkness before him. The figure advanced, step by step, silent but heavy. Its eyes glowed brighter, and Mark could feel the cold creeping into his bones, spreading fear into every corner of his mind. The hallway seemed to narrow around him, closing in, and for the first time, he understood the truth. This wasn't just a prison gone wrong. The Blackout had unleashed something hidden in the very walls of Rikers, something older, something that had been waiting for a night like this. The missing inmate grabbed Mark again. "We have to get to the roof. There's a way out. Maybe, but we have to move now." Mark hesitated for a split second. That hesitation almost cost him. The figure lunged, and a gust of icy air slammed against him, knocking him to the floor. He scrambled to his feet, lungs burning, vision blurred. Behind them, the hallway groaned and the walls seemed to pulse. The prison itself was alive, angry, feeding on the chaos. They ran, hearts pounding, shadows twisting all around them. Every step was a fight against panic, against the darkness, against the thing hunting them. And just as they reached the stairwell leading to the roof, a deafening crack echoed from above. The ceiling itself was splitting. Dust and debris rained down like a storm, forcing them to duck and shield their heads. Mark looked up and froze. Through the falling dust, he could see his shape, bigger than any man, eyes glowing, moving impossibly fast across the broken ceiling toward them. He realized, in a bone-chilling instant, that the prison had become a predator, and tonight it had chosen its prey. The stairwell was a nightmare of shadows and falling debris. Mark and the missing inmate scrambled upward, coughing, shielding their eyes from dust, and praying the ceiling wouldn't collapse entirely. Every step felt like a battle against the building itself, as if Rikers had become a living maze designed to trap them. They burst onto the roof, gasping for air. Moonlight spilled over the prison, illuminating twisted steel fences and dark corners where more shadows seemed to writhe. For a moment, the world seemed calm, but Mark knew better. The calm was just a pause before the next wave of terror. "Look," the missing inmate whispered, pointing to a fire escape ladder dangling precariously from the edge. "It's our only way down. We climb, we don't stop." "Got it," Mark nodded, though fear had frozen his legs. The figure from the stairwell appeared at the rooftop's entrance, its glowing eyes cutting through the moonlight, unmoving yet impossibly fast. Its shadow stretched across the roof like a dark hand reaching for them. They ran toward the ladder. Each footstep echoed like a drumbeat in Mark's ears. Behind them, the creature, or whatever it was, moved with impossible speed, silent, deliberate, and unyielding. Mark reached the ladder first, grabbing it and swinging his legs over. The missing inmate followed, but a sudden gust of wind, cold and unnatural, made the ladder sway violently. Mark clung on, heart racing, as the sound of the shadow crashing against the rooftop echoed like a thunderclap. A scream ripped through the air. Mark glanced down and saw another figure, an inmate who hadn't made it in time, being pulled back into the darkness by unseen hands. The sound of metal scraping against metal, followed by a bone-chilling groan, made Mark's stomach twist. "Keep climbing," the missing inmate shouted. Mark pulled himself higher, every muscle straining, every breath shallow. The ladder shook under the combined weight and wind. Behind him, the shadows moved across the rooftop, coalescing into shapes that were almost human, but too fast, too cruel, too alive. Halfway down, Mark's hand slipped on the icy metal. He screamed, gripping desperately. The missing inmate's hand shot out, catching him just in time. The ladder swayed again, and the shadows leaped closer, glowing eyes fixed on them. Mark realized something terrifying. Even if they reached the ground, the prison wasn't done. It was hunting them, alive in ways no human could fight. Then, from below, a deafening roar echoed, louder than anything Mark had ever heard. The fire escape rattled violently. The shadows froze for a heartbeat, and for just a second, the world seemed suspended. And in that heartbeat, Mark knew one terrifying truth. They might reach the roof's edge, but there was no guarantee they'd survive the fall or the darkness waiting for them below. Mark's fingers burned as he slid down the fire escape, the metal biting into his palms. The missing inmate followed close behind, his breathing sharp and ragged. Above them, the sky churned with thick clouds that swallowed the moonlight, casting Rikers Island into an unnatural darkness again. Then came a sound, a low hum, like an electrical surge tried to return, but distorted, twisted, as if the power itself was screaming. "Almost there," the missing inmate shouted. Mark's boots hit the final rung, and he dropped the last few feet, landing hard on the concrete below. His knees buckled, but he forced himself up. They had made it off the roof. For a brief moment, relief washed over him, until he looked around. The yard was silent. Too silent. The wind had stopped. Even the sirens had died down. The air hung thick and still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. "Where is everyone?" Mark whispered. The missing inmate shook his head. "They should have been here. Guards, inmates, someone." He trailed off. The yard was littered with shoes, flashlights, and radios, scattered, as if everyone had simply vanished mid-step. Mark bent down, picking up a flashlight. It flickered weakly, then went dead. And then, from behind the far wall, came a sound, a slow, dragging shuffle. Mark froze. "Did you hear that?" The missing inmate nodded, eyes wide. The sound grew louder, boots scraping against concrete, one slow step after another. A silhouette appeared near the gate. Broad shoulders, a prison uniform, but its movements were wrong. Too stiff. Too unnatural. "Hey!" Mark shouted, his voice trembling. "Who's there?" The figure stopped. Its head turned toward them, but there was no face, just darkness where its eyes and mouth should have been. The missing inmate grabbed Mark's arm. "Run!" They bolted toward the east gate. Their footsteps echoed wildly, and the shadows seemed to move with them, crawling along the walls like liquid smoke. Mark glanced back once and saw the faceless figure running now, silent but fast, too fast. They reached the gate. It was locked. "Help me!" The missing inmate yelled, shaking it violently. "It's jammed." Mark looked around desperately, spotting a small maintenance shed nearby. "Over there," he said, dragging him toward it. They rushed inside and slammed the door shut. The shed was small, filled with old mops, tools, and a faint smell of bleach. Mark tried to steady his breathing, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. "What was that thing?" "I don't know," the missing inmate whispered, pressing his ear to the door. "But it's not human." Outside, the footsteps stopped. Silence. Then 3 slow knocks. Mark's heart pounded. The missing inmate's eyes went wide. Another 3 knocks. Harder this time. And then a whisper through the cracks of the door, low, distorted, and chillingly familiar. "Mark, you shouldn't have opened the door." Mark froze. The voice wasn't the missing inmate's. It was his own. The sound of metal creaking filled the shed as the doorknob began to twist slowly on its own. Mark stumbled backward, his chest heaving. The doorknob turned slowly, the sound scraping through the silence like metal grinding against bone. "Don't open it," whispered the missing inmate, gripping a broken mop handle like a weapon. His hands trembled, eyes wide with terror. The door creaked open. Nothing. Only the cold air of the yard rushed in, carrying the faint smell of smoke and something else, something metallic. Mark stepped closer, his flashlight barely flickering to life. "Hello." The beam cut through the darkness. In the yard, faint outlines began to appear, bodies. Dozens of them, guards and inmates alike, lying still, eyes open but glassy, faces pale. The air was thick with silence. The missing inmate gasped. "What happened to them?" Mark shook his head, his voice breaking. They're not breathing." He stepped forward, scanning the yard. Every figure was frozen in place, as if time had stopped for them. Radios still in hand, mouths mid-scream. And then the power came back on. The floodlights roared to life, blinding him. Sirens screamed across the prison, and doors began to unlock automatically. The world was suddenly loud again, too loud. Mark covered his ears, stumbling. The yard was empty now. The body's gone. The missing inmate was gone too. Wait, Mark shouted, spinning around. Where are you? Only his echo answered him. Guards rushed into the yard moments later, weapons drawn, barking orders. Freeze! Hands up! Mark dropped to his knees, his mind spinning. When they dragged him back inside, he tried to explain what happened. The blackout, the missing people, the shadows, the faceless thing. No one believed him. Lights went out for 12 hours, the warden later said. Generators failed, systems glitched. Panic spread. Some inmates tried to escape, others hid. But everyone was accounted for in the morning. Everyone except one. Mark never saw the missing inmate again. His name wasn't on any list. No record of his transfer, no file, nothing. It was as if he'd never existed. Weeks later, Mark sat alone in his cell, staring at the flickering light overhead. Every night, just before the lights went out for bed check, he heard it again, 3 slow knocks on his cell wall. And then that same twisted whisper, "You shouldn't have opened the door." The light flickered once more, then went out. OUTRO for YouTube narration. If you thought prison was terrifying before, imagine living through 12 hours of darkness where reality bends, people vanish, and even your own voice turns against you. This was the night the lights went out. 12 hours of terror inside Rikers Island. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe for more true and chilling tales from behind prison walls.